Matthew 27:51. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. From the very beginning of time, God's intention was that man and God should live together in harmony and fellowship. And unfortunately, because of man's sin, the moment of that first disobedience, that veil, that curtain came down, separating man from God. It wasn't his desire that that should happen, but in order to protect man from the holiness of God, that sin cannot dwell in the presence of a holy God, that veil, that separation came down, and the intention, the plan of God was put on pause. The fellowship was broken. Now, as we see throughout the book of Genesis, God continues to reach out to man to start that covenant relationship with him and make that plan for restoration of that relationship. You notice that it wasn't man reaching out for God, but it was God reaching out for man. From the very beginning, man hid when he sinned, but God came looking for him in the wilderness. It was God who spoke to Noah and said, "Build the ark." It was God who spoke to Abraham and said, "I will make a covenant with you." It was God who spoke to Moses and said, "Deliver my people." And it was God who gave the plan for the tabernacle. And later on, that tabernacle became the pattern for the temple. Now, the tabernacle was the place where God would dwell with his people, but there still had to be that veil of separation, that curtain. In the design of the tabernacle, there was a place that was the dwelling place of God, the Holy of Holies, and only the high priest could enter. And even before he could enter, he had to make a sacrifice for himself to make sure that he was pure enough to be in the presence of God. And so there was that curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the tabernacle. And in the temple, we also have that curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. And scholars tell us that in the New Testament time, that curtain was not just a mere piece of cloth, but it was thick. It was about 4 to 6 inches thick, just layer upon layer of cloth, upon layer of cloth, upon layer of cloth. Nobody was going to tear that thing apart. It was solid. And every year on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would go in and he would make intercession for his people, and he would offer the sacrifices, the blood of sheep and goats, as an atonement for the sins of the people. And then, finally, on that day, on Good Friday, at Calvary, when Jesus Christ breathed his last, hanging there on that cross, the scripture tells us that among the many miracles that occurred, the darkness, the people rising from the graves, the earthquake, the stones being split, that the temple veil was rent in two, that it was torn apart. And it doesn't say from the bottom to the top, but it was from the top down to the bottom. God opened up the way. He made his presence felt. People could come to the Holy of Holies. They could come to the very throne of God to make his intercession for his people. That we could make intercession for ourselves and for our family and for our loved ones. That fellowship with God is being restored. That we can now walk with Christ, that we can walk with God because he gave his life, because he was that ultimate sacrifice, because, as the book of Hebrews tells us, he was the high priest who didn't need to make a sacrifice for himself to be acceptable unto God, but he went there himself, made intercession. And that sacrifice was once and for all. That sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross, his blood making atonement for us, opened the way. That veil rent, not from bottom to top, but top to bottom. God opens the way. God initiates that concept. God initiates that relationship, that contact with us, and we respond in kind because he has done it for us. He took the first step. And now we have that fellowship with God once again. And we're going to have that fellowship with God perfectly when we see him again in glory. Good evening.